and welcome to Connected Conversations for Creatives. I'm your host, Jennifer Carr, and today joining me is soon-to-be self-published author Hyrum Hawks. Thank you so much for taking the time to hang out with me today and just have this conversation.
Happy to join you.
That's great. So we've got a really cool conversation ahead of us. But first, let me just ask you to tell us a little bit about your background, because you shared with me that you have some really great education, which is amazing to me. Like, I love education. I love teaching. I love learning. And I think that probably has some connections with some interesting work experience that I'd love to hear about.
Sure. So education was always critical. And I grew up we talked about outer space and science fiction all the time. Neither of my parents have anything to do with it, but my dad would always ask me questions, especially once I got into doing science in high school and junior high. But he'd ask things like, well, if the warp cell in this overloaded, what would, and he'd ask for real answers to hypothetical things. And that really just was the start for me. When I went to college, I thought I wanted to be a bioengineer, realized very quickly I didn't like the bio part, and actually first became a chemist. I was working towards a PhD in chemistry when I realized I want to do something bigger than that. So I got the master's in chemistry and then went back to school and got a master's in chemical engineering, and I worked for over 15 years at this point in various heavy industries as essentially a consultant, doing things like mineral processing, oil and gas, aerospace. And then I really wanted to get deeper into aerospace. And so I went back to school at the Colorado School of Mines. And they're one of the few programs in the world that has what's called the Space Resources Program, specifically focused on outer space resource utilization. And so I did a master's program in that. And so now I'm over-credentialed but have lots of fun.
So why become a writer/author?
Well, I didn't realize it, but I've always kind of been a storyteller. I'm somewhat addicted to making people laugh. And I didn't realize that until just over a year ago, when I have two of my older children want to be authors. They would dabble in writing, but at the same time, they just didn't really know how to do it. They didn't know what direction to take. And so I said, oh, I'm going to learn how to write so that I can tell them what to do. Because, I'm an engineer. I just assumed I could do anything. And I started listening to the Writing Excuses podcast, and quickly realized this is fun, and started dabbling in it myself. And so about 4 months into deep diving into that, I just started writing my first story. And I wrote a 40,000 word novella that I'm looking forward to rewriting when I get better, because it basically is a conspiracy theorist who accidentally figures out how to make space travel work without propellant, and had rescued a bioengineered ferret. And the story is told from the ferret's point of view. So when that was a big hit with my family and my friends, I said, this is a kind of addicting. And I've not looked back since. And even though I've got, I'm a high level engineer, but if I could get to that point where I could replace my income, I would switch over in a heartbeat.
Oh yeah, I think that's the dream, right? That is the dream. But there's only one way to reach that dream, and that's just to start doing it, which you have, right? You've taken that first step, which is fantastic. All right, so you have, I think you said, a book that you're hoping to have out come May?
Probably June.
Okay.
I wrote a book. I was at a space conference and I had the idea, what would happen? Well, I've been to Turkey on business, and I was automating a gold mine out there. And then I got thinking, what would happen if I got kidnapped? A team of engineers got kidnapped into Iran and had to escape on a rocket. And so that story became my main one that I focused on. And I wrote it in about 6 weeks or so, the first draft, and then have revised and revised and revised as I've learned more. And so, yeah, I've got it with final edits this next month or so, and hoping I'm learning all the publishing software and
Yeah, it is a process that you go into it thinking, I'm going to put these words on paper and it's going to be perfect and beautiful and wrap it up in a bow and everybody's going to buy it. And then you're like, wait a second, there's a lot more to this than I expected.
And it's been a real challenge because I've had to also And it's actually been a great pleasure because I've been able to make friends with a lot of Iranian Americans here in Utah who've been beta readers for me and have given me great tips on how to do things. I mean, even just the other day, they said I should send them my cover design, and they're like, you might want to be careful. That building looks kind of like it could be a mosque. You don't want to have a mosque on the cover of your book because even though they're all on board with the current regime falling, it's don't bring religion into it. And I'm like, oh yeah, that makes total sense. And so it's great. It's been great to meet people as I've learned more and more about writing. But yeah, it's going to be fun to put something out there. Though how to best do it, I wanted to do traditional publishing at first, but then I realized the traditional publishing I learned about as a kid when I was an avid reader is not the same thing that exists today.
Yes, I that is something that kind of shocked me too in this whole process was
Mhm.
and it just kind of it appealed to me more that I got into it, that I had more control over the whole process as well, which
Oh yeah.
that sits well with me. I'm good with that because it's my work and I know what's best for my work. Whereas and it's my timeline. Like it's a lot faster apparently to do it for yourself as well.
Yeah. Yeah. It would be a year and a half minimum, is what I've understood. And that's
Mhm.
if I land an agent and land an editor.
Exactly. And so I think self-publishing it is a new horizon that and what really worries me, and this is so like not even what we said we were going to talk about today, but I love this conversation because people don't realize that they go in looking for an agent. And you know what? For some people, an agent and a publishing house is what they need. It's what's best for their work. But for the rest of us, I think that this new world of self-publishing it holds a lot of potential just to for freedom, I guess. There's a lot less censorship when it comes to self-publishing. There's a lot more flexibility when it comes to self-publishing. So like I have enjoyed learning along the way. It's not been easy, but I have definitely enjoyed learning the process.
Yes. Well, and that really is part of my writing process, actually, is that exploration and discovery. I've I've tried all sorts of different things, and realizing it's the arrogance of an engineer, maybe, is that I've always assumed I can do whatever I need to do because I've always just had to do whatever's needed to be done. And so that's I step into work like this and say, hey, let's figure it out. And so, I mean, being an engineer like I've been, I was never a desk engineer. I spent a lot of time at the desk, but I was in the field. I've gone to mines all over the world. I've put automation on facilities in Turkey. I've gone to Estonia, Germany, Nigeria, Brazil. I've done work, of course, the U.S., all over the U.S. And you just kind of make it up as you go when you're a field engineer. And that's what I'm kind of a mix of a discovery writer and a little bit of plotter.
Mhm.
Not much, but like I discovered that I like the 7 point story structure because with those 7 points, that's just enough that I can put in where I want it to start, which is almost always have that. I put in where it's going to end, which I almost always kind of have an idea where I want it to end. And so then I just put in some key points because then I don't then I don't wander too far from the goal. And that's how
Yeah.
I wrote my first full length book, was that I knew what I wanted. In the end, I wanted them to escape on a rocket. And it's pretty telegraphed. I'm not spoiling anything for people that read it. They're trying to escape on a rocket. How they get there is insane, but that's part of writing.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I think the whole publishing industry is kind of a discovery writing and acting type thing right now because it's so up in flux. I mean, we don't even know if some of our biggest marketing platforms are still going to exist in a few days, weeks, like TikTok. I've built up a following on TikTok. It's mostly authors, but
Mhm.
it's the start, it's a foundation, and it might be gone. So we wing it.
Absolutely. And that is one of those things that, and I will just encourage you and anybody else who's listening who may be relying on social media as their biggest networking platform and sales platform. Like you've got to build up your newsletter. Like you have got to start connecting with people in other places other than because and what's really funny is I saw a thing come across TikTok the other day where they were hiring for their own sort of publishing house, right? Like Book Talk has kind of taken off to the point where now TikTok is trying to make money on getting a hold of books and publishing books as well. And I thought
They can do
that
that
might be
great.
taking it that might be taking it a little too far. But I mean, who even knows if we'll have TikTok, like you said, in a couple weeks or whatever. It's just
Exactly.
kind of bizarre. So you have to diversify. I mean, it's no different than the stock market. Like you have to
Mhm.
diversify your portfolio when it comes to marketing your
Me,
books.
as a discovery writer, I have to write and keep it fresh. Otherwise, because I don't know what's going on in my story. I know where I want it to go vaguely, but I don't know how to get there.
So it's really interesting to me when I talk to someone who clearly has like very strong left brain tendencies. And for those who are listening, like in psychology, we relate the left brain to logical and analytical thinking. So like, and also language processing, reasoning, math, that kind of thing. And it's considered to be the more dominant part of the brain when you're in tasks that require attention to detail, planning, problem solving, all of that stuff. Whereas
Mhm.
like right-brained people, they're associated with like creative and intuitive thinking and spatial awareness, visual imagery, and all that good stuff, artistic expression. So when I meet someone who is like me and utilizes both halves of the brain fairly equally, because you kind of have to, when you're an author, you rely on that right brain a lot. I'm always curious how midbrainers how their writing process looks. You talk about having like the 7-point plan kind of thing, and that's probably even more planning than I do for my writing. Like I do have a beginning and an end. Like I always see those things. But in the middle, it just comes out however I see the story play out in my head a lot of times. And so I think the term is like plantser, right? The
Mhm.
the plotter and the pantser. I'm definitely the in between.
Yeah. Well, for me, even those middle sections are really just endpoints of a smaller story. You've got to make it to plot point one. You've got to make it to the pinch point. You got to make it to the midpoint. And I like what I've learned. I went to a writing conference, LTUE, Life, the Universe, and Everything, which is a great name for a conference. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and there were some great talks on it. And the number one thing is even if you're purely going to discovery write, is know how story structures work. So engage that left side of your brain, even if you're not a scientist or an engineer. If you engage that and just absolutely become aware of how story structure works, then unconsciously, when you're discovery writing, you will see that as a guidepost. So we don't think about that, but when we're reading a book, okay, I went to see Dungeons and Dragons on Saturday. I haven't gone to a movie in years, simply because I haven't seen anything come out, but I heard good things about it, and I this is the first movie I've seen where I saw it as a writer because I'd learned the story structure. I've binged every episode of Writing Excuses up till this year. And it was really well done. You can see, and I was like, oh, they're hitting the story structure points. And it's one of the reasons it worked, while some of the recent movies that have really flopped are doing so terribly, is they're not following the structure. You can totally discovery write a book with following the story structure. And I think that's part of, I'm pretty odd in the engineering field in that I'm not an engineer that enjoys the nitty gritty math. I don't necessarily like doing the simulations. I like the overall. I tell the story. I actually say
Mm-hmm.
I'm a linguist. As an engineer, I'm a linguist. So I am a systems engineer more than anything. I may be a chemist, a chemical engineer, and all that, but I've learned enough of the language of electrical, mechanical, civil, that I can go into a meeting with these people and say, all right, I need this, and this. And then I know if what they delivered me is good or bad. And that's really key, is that as an author, that's all you are. If you think about yourself as a systems engineer, I don't, do you read Brandon Sanderson?
Mm-hmm.
In the Stormlight Archive, minor spoiler, but Navani, one of the main characters, is a systems engineer.
Mm-hmm.
I will die on that hill. She doesn't know the details of everything, but she knows enough about everything to direct people on research. She's a classic head of R&D, but she has to understand. So as an author, you're also the head of R&D, you're the head of engineering. But if you dive too deep into any one thing, then it's unnecessary. But if you know just enough about, say, horses, that you can write intelligibly about a horse, you don't say that it galloped for 4 days straight. No, that's silly. But you only know that's silly because you've learned just enough about it to know not to say certain things. And that's how I view writing. Is it's a giant linguistics feat, because I have to understand the language of my female characters, my male characters, my alien characters, my fantasy characters, whatever genre I'm writing in, I have to be able to speak their language.
Mhm.
Now, am I ever going to speak perfectly the language of a sociopathic, dictatorial general from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard? No. But can I learn enough about how people like that operate that I could write some intelligible dialogue? Yeah. And that's, to me, being an author is that curiosity. And that's why discovery writing is so fun. And I argue that all plotters are discovery writers. It's just they're doing it in tiny increments instead of big ones.
I think that is exactly right. That is brilliant because you do have to know a little bit about everything you're writing in order for like, and you have to get to know your characters. Like you have to like dive deep in some of those characters, and you have to do research because if you do want to know how to be a dictatorial, regime leader, like you have to be able to get into their heads. So I love that. That is brilliant to think that even those plotters are pantsers. They just don't know it yet. That's
Do it in
hilarious.
small. It's like they take it in small doses. We're just more willing to go on a limb.
Yes, we're like the kids who are just like freewheeling it on the swings. We're just going as high as we can, and they're like, "No, I
Mhm.
have to take my slow and steady swings." It's like, no, listen, we're having way more fun over here, learning how to just dive right in. Um, so I know, like in science fiction and fantasy, like I've got one of those on the back burner. I started it last year, and I've been focusing so much on the series that I started with, and I was like, I'll get back to it. But I know that like, there are so many moving parts, and so as only kind of a sort of planner, like, do you ever struggle to keep your characters straight or your world building consistent or anything like that?
Well, I try to keep a spreadsheet, but if you want to understand the psyche of someone like me, my dad hates math. My dad can't balance a checkbook to save his life, not because he doesn't want to, but because the math, he can't do it. He taught me when I was 8 years old. Now, this is back in 1989, and when we didn't have Windows yet, everything was in DOS. I had to use DOS commands,
Mhm.
and he taught me how to use spreadsheets, the black and white version. This is before there was color Excel or any of that. This was Quattro, I think. I can't. It's been a long time. Q Basic, one of those. Again, over 30 years ago. So he taught me, and he said, "This is how I don't have to do math." And so my dad, for his entire career, for the last 40 years or so, he has spent his life on spreadsheets to do all the math for him, including addition, subtraction, everything. Now, he didn't realize that I can do it in my head, but I love spreadsheets. And so that is how I organize my brain. And so I write a book, but then as I'm writing, I will go into the spreadsheet and throw in the name and say, "Oh, this is who this is." Now, I've got the ability to retain in my head a very large amount of information, which is helpful, but even then, I don't want to have to go back in 10 years. So I would recommend that to anyone. I mean, I've heard people use Scrivener or other things, but to me, there's nothing quite like just building the spreadsheet. You can use the same template for the future things if you like, get one you like, but that way you're organically putting together after you've written. And it's good to take a break after each writing session and just toss into it what you did, because then later you can go back and say, that made no sense, or I need to revise just this little bit. I should make sure to go back in. I also use the bracket trick in the text.
Mhm.
It's like description.
Yeah, yes.
Because I do not write description very well on the first draft. I have severe white room syndrome on my first draft.
Oh,
But
I can totally understand that. That is perfectly relatable. I make highlights. I highlight it and I'm like, come back here, or I'll leave like I have a Google document that I use, and I leave a big old comment that says, "You're not done here," to remind myself to come back. So I totally can relate to the brackets. Mm-hmm.
yeah, but I guess as an engineer, I don't like to have things undone.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why the spreadsheet helps, because then I know I'm not going to forget it.
That makes sense. And now I can get on board with your dad's opinion on math. Like it just can't be done. Like that was never, has never been, will never be my subject. But I did marry a guy who adores spreadsheets. Like I think he bleeds Excel pretty much. And
Yeah.
so he's always like, if we can make a spreadsheet for it. And I'm like, no, I cannot. Thank you. Because they're not pretty enough for me. And so my brain immediately tunes them out.
Oh,
Like I
you
can
see the
spreadsheets.
beauty in them?
I
Look,
don't,
I have.
I don't like, hey,
Let,
he's like,
let me
I
see if I can
know.
explain this to to a more artistic person. But imagine you have a spreadsheet. Now, I there was a spreadsheet I wrote that took a year and a half. This was a year and a half of my full-time life. It ended up being over a gigabyte, and it's not like it had images. This was all calculations. So it was found. The foundation was cores, the core logs of deep drill holes for an oil shale project. And this oil shale project, every foot was measured, and it had all sorts of data on it. And so you've got to understand that those numbers mean something. They are actually painting the picture of the vast wealth of the underground at that location and of its downsides. And then I had to put together a spreadsheet that could take that, turn it into a 3D model, and then take that and put economics on top of it to see it was a viable thing. And so overall, this spreadsheet, and it would take several minutes to run sometimes when I change parameters. And so it became this massive art project to me. That's how I see spreadsheets. And it's the same way I see telling a story. It's part of linguistics is that spreadsheet told a story. I could put any assumption that management had into it and spit out an entire multi-billion-dollar project estimate, and they could take that and use it. And so that's the art of spreadsheets to me. They become a beautiful thing because the creation that goes into them, it's just that it's not something that most people can see.
And I respect, like, I think it is amazing. It was probably 2 weeks ago. He called me in and he said, hey, look at what I did with the spreadsheet. And it was something that he had created. And he was like, all I have to do is like click this and it does this. And I was like, that is beautiful. That is wonderful. I don't know what it means. Like it just, but I see it. It's probably because there was trauma involved from my, CS 101 class, like 20 some odd years ago, where they were like, you have to know how to do all this stuff. And I'm like, I'll never use it like that. Liberal arts, like liberal arts, that's me. And so I never really got on board with the spreadsheet. I do use Dabble Writer. It's an online application that kind of helps you keep up with your plots and your subplots, and it formats everything for you, and it's really pretty. And so I see that, and that's like my spreadsheet. That's my Excel. And so it's super easy to use, and it looks nice. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it is a glorified spreadsheet is what it is, yes, because you go over.
You'll never do differential equations in it.
I wouldn't do that on paper. I wouldn't do that in Excel. Like I can guarantee you that is not on my radar.
Well, if your husband ever needs someone to show off his spreadsheet to, have him send it to me, and I will geek out over it.
I guarantee you guys would be best friends. Like I have zero doubt in my mind. Like y'all would just sit there and talk. Y'all could talk spreadsheet and smart guy stuff all day long, and I would just be like, "Oh, that's so sweet." I got nothing. But if you want to talk psychological, like abnormal psych or developmental psychology or child psychology, I am your gal. Like I can talk that all day long. But
and I think that's the key to being a good author is caring about all those things. Even though I'll never care enough to like take a course in it. And the one subject I will never care about, and I have to enough to like write full world building things, it's economics. Oh my gosh, I hate it.
I made a D. Like how they let me out is beyond me, but I made a D and they were like, that's fine, just go.
It's funny,
but with world building you can at least create your own economic system if you wanted to be like, everything is free or not, whatever.
And one of the benefits of becoming an author from a scientific background is that we know how to find information. So make friends with your science authors, because if you ask us a question, we will go down the rabbit hole. So just yesterday, I'm writing a short story that's very depressing, but my sisters recommended even write the depressing stories, that ideas, because then you learn how to torment your characters better, because I'm not very good at that. And so I had to look up what percentage of UV light makes it through from stars. Just a random thing, but yeah, learned enough to know that nobody studied that. So I can make.
Well, I mean, that is surprising. That seems like one of those topics that everyone should know.
Yeah.
That's wild. But at the same time, as authors, we can rely on each other because I know who I will run to when I'm like, hey, did you by any chance figure out the amount of UV light that comes from? Because, and then if you're like, hey, I need to know about abnormal psych, like tell me about a sociopath and what that looks like. I'll be like, I'll be glad. I got a profile for you right here.
Oh yeah.
Because, and that's another thing, like as an author, you can provide these resources. I have a thing on TikTok every Thursday. I have what's called Author Talk, and it's literally using psychology in writing so that you can develop your characters using psychology so they're more realistic. Like I know that part of character building and writing is how to create people, because people are my thing. That's what I do. I'm a marriage and family counselor, and I taught psychology for years. And so, you do what you're good at, and then share the wealth with other people.
Exactly. Well, and that's why I've decided to co-author on some of my books, because while I can come up with a really fun story idea, I can't always give it the flair of a certain genre. I don't have in my soul the words of a Regency romance.
Right.
But I came up with a story that has excited a lot of people for an alt history Regency sci-fi. And I wrote the first draft. It's proven fun. I'm testing the water with several different editors to see if they'd be willing to be my co-author, because I'm never going to be able to properly torment the protagonists and make sure that their love is stretched to the breaking point and that they go through the depths of despair. I love Anne of Green Gables, for example, but I don't understand a bosom buddy, as she terms it. I have 2 friends total, and I don't have room for more than 2 friends, and that doesn't include my wife. My wife is my best, but I have 2 friends, and the only way that I get more friends is if one of them dies. And so, because how would I've got a science friend and I've got a writing friend. Done.
I mean, what more do you need, honestly? I mean,
that's all I need.
I get that. And that is genius, because it's really funny. My sister is my editor for my second book that's coming out this year. And I didn't work with her the first time because I wasn't sure how it would be to work with family, but I have really loved working with her. Like we feed off of each other so well, that it's funny that you even brought up co-authoring, because this morning I literally thought, because I was thinking about my little science fiction fantasy book that I've got going on. And I was like, she would actually be really good at writing this part if I wrote this part, because it goes back and forth between like a world of magic who is keeping an eye on the real world kind of thing. And I was like, I could write the real world kind of thing, because I really don't want to do the whole world building. And I was like, she would be really good at that. So to co-author with somebody that that you could say, I trust you, one, with my work, because this is still, my name is still going on it with yours, but that they could make your work even better. I love that. That's a great idea. And that just kind of confirmed for me that I might be making a phone call tomorrow.
Well, and I think that's part of my marketing plan. I don't have a good marketing plan yet, but I've got one. I'm trying Ream. Ream, which is basically like Patreon for authors. I haven't gotten my account yet, but I'm on the waiting list. And as soon as that comes through, I'm going to start putting that together and try to do a subscription model. And my goal is to have at least 3 other authors that I partner with, so that people, when they subscribe, there will be options to select those other people as well. And then we will build. We will each have our own newsletter. But if someone decides they want more than one of us as to be subscribed to, well, then we'll shift them so that they're now subscribed to both of us. And they get more benefits, a little less, save a little bit of money, try to build up a code team. Because I know that the reason I started reading Dan Wells is because of Brandon Sanderson, because they're friends, and because Sanderson promoted him. And then I started reading Howard Taylor on accident, but Howard Taylor is also on there, but went to the Writing Excuses podcast, and then they have Mary Robinette Kowal. And holy cow, I love her writing, but I would never have found her without the other authors. And so that's my philosophy, is build an author team, so that, because I'm going to read, even Sanderson can't keep up with my reading. I want to read more, and I don't have time for reading now.
Right.
But when I was younger, I would read. I've read thousands of novels. I know I have. And so I couldn't have just had one author. But if I knew this author and these are his friends, and they write good stuff too, well, then I'm totally going to try reading their stuff. And if I like it, I'm going to read all their stuff too. And so I've
That's
read
yeah.
most of those other books.
That's brilliant. Creating a network, and that is something that authors don't realize because we like to work. Well, I say we. I shouldn't generalize. I like to work solo, like I do. It's my world. It's my imagination. It's my time to do my thing.
Mhm.
But it is so important for us to create a network so that we can one support each other, and rely on each other. But that collaboration, like that could go so much farther than
Yeah.
just hey, you should read this guy's stuff. Like that could really.
This could be, hey, if you read this guy's stuff, guess what? If you sign up for both of us, you'll also get, here's something we co-authored. Or,
Mm-hmm.
hey, we do a live stream together where we shoot the breeze and talk about garbage. I mean, that's one thing Dan Wells and Brandon Sanderson do, is they have their own little podcast where he's signing books the whole time, and they're just shooting the breeze, talking about random nonsense, most of
Mm-hmm.
which, that's great. I would watch that for some of my other the author people I like. And I know that we're solitary creatures in some ways, but that's when we're writing. Then I think that if we all teamed up on our marketing, we I think we can bypass the publishing companies by having us build up a network. And I want to do that for me. And I've got, my sister going to be on that team. She's got some great fantasy books, and I think she's a spectacular author. She just hasn't had her chance yet.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so as we build that kind of network, I mean, I'm a sci-fi author and fantasy author at heart, but I kind of think they're the same genre. Just
Location, like that's really the the difference. And that's kind of what my goal was here with this platform, is to say, hey, like we don't write the same genre. Like I do have a sci-fi that I've worked on, but it has taken the back burner. Like I write romantic suspense, basically, is what I
Mhm.
have kind of produced in the last 2 years. And so which is a very different genre, but that doesn't mean I read everything. Like I read everything. I may write very specific things, but I read everything. So my goal here was to be like, hey, this person has XYZ, ready to go. Let's collaborate. Let's get you connected and that kind of thing. Because it's very hard to come up with a marketing plan, for one thing. Like I would really like to have one. And right now I don't know what that is. And so instead I talk to people and connect with people and hope for the best.
No, I think, and I know I'm deviating completely from the outline,
Mhm.
but I'm so ADD. Um, I've discovered that my son, he's 9, my youngest, and he wants to do whatever dad is doing. And so he's been trying to do his own hand at writing. And I keep telling, he's like, what should I write about? I'm like, read first.
Mhm.
And because the book I wrote, The Persian Asteroid, I wrote it because I had life experience. I mean, almost everything in that book is either something I experienced myself or is something that I imagined because of something I experienced. But you can totally shortcut life experience by reading.
Mhm.
And that's really what the whole point of education. I got all those degrees, and what that tells to an employer is that I have bypassed having 60 years of experience by having crammed it all into this tiny bundle of schooling.
Mhm.
And that's the same with reading novels. If you read everything that Sanderson and Pratchett and Gaiman, I always wanted to call it Gaiman, I mean, all those authors, if you read what they've written, etc., there's so many more. Nedicor, um, you read that, you can write, because even though you've never experienced it, because, well, nobody's experienced fantasy.
Right.
Unless if they have, they're really holding back. I mean,
You feel left out, don't you?
I do. I do.
Or they're on something, which is the
Yeah.
totally flip side of things. So, yeah.
Well, I collect conspiracy theories like some people do stamps, because they're so entertaining. And
Yes.
my absolute favorite, it's not really a conspiracy theory. I hope it's a joke, but I'm sure someone takes it seriously. Oxygen is actually a hallucinogen, and only those who stop breathing it actually come out of the rabbit hole. And I'm like, well, that's kind of true, but no.
Oh my gosh, that is so funny. We love conspiracy theories over here. We were driving to gosh, we were driving to town last week, and I mean blackbirds all over the yard, just all over it. I was like, those aren't real. Those aren't real, right?
That's one of my favorites, is the birds aren't real.
My
Yeah.
kid, she's 13, and she was like, what? Like we had never said it before. And she was like, I don't understand. I was like, me neither. It's like,
That's a great foundation for a fantasy story is the conspiracy theories. You take a
yes,
conspiracy theory and you just say, what if it was true?
what
What
if?
would it do? And I mean the Anunnaki. I still don't understand what the heck Anunnaki are. Um, but what if there were aliens? Well, that's kind of the basis for my alt history Regency sci-fi is what if there were ancient civilizations that existed and they accidentally
Oh,
left behind a holographic capable cell phone.
you and my husband would get along swimmingly. He opened his phone yesterday and Facebook immediately showed him like the Egyptian pyramids and was talking about aliens and he was like, I've often wondered, and I was like, stop. Like just stop. Like somebody's listening, and we are probably on so many watch lists. It's not even funny, just because of our conspiracy theory talk. Like, but anyway, so yeah, y'all would. So speaking of all of these inspirational moments, what's been your biggest source of inspiration for your work to date?
Oh, that is actually one of the tougher questions.
Mm-hmm.
I think therapy. I have tried to go to therapy on and off for 25 years. I've
Okay.
only had a good therapist that fit me. I mean, the others were probably good therapists. They just weren't good for
Mm-hmm.
me
Mm-hmm.
for the last 2 and 1.5. And that made a huge difference for me. But what I've realized is that all along, I've wanted to make people laugh. And to me, that's kind of the inspiration for almost all of my stories is would this entertain me and how can I share it? But even then, I have anxiety and depression. I always have.
Mm-hmm.
It took me 20 years to finally accept the fact that it's not a moral failing. I really do have depression because otherwise I would take over the world. So I think God nerfed me. But um, I one of the traumas, I've had some pretty bad relationships in the past. Well, I've of course worried, what if my wife secretly hates me? Well, she doesn't. I mean, I know that. But anxiety, depression tells you your brain is lying to you.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
therapy taught me that, but I'm like, well, now I know that, but what if it were real? Or what if you people cheat? I don't understand it. I never have,
Mm-hmm.
but people do cheat. And like, what if a woman showed up at my front porch pregnant with my baby, but I've never met her? And she's a time traveler from the future. And my wife had died like a year from now. I remarry, and she's pregnant, and the world is about to end. I've invented time travel. I send her back in time, and she's there to warn us, and we've got to save the day. Well, that's kind of hilarious.
Yeah.
So basically, take all the trauma, find a find what's funny in it, and then turn it into a story. And besides just being entertaining as an author, it's really therapeutic to take
Oh
your
yeah.
trauma and write it down and put a face on it, because then you can laugh at your own trauma. And boom, not only has it, so writing has not only been just plain fun, I've probably fought down my anxiety and depression more in the last year than anything else in my whole life.
Okay, that is I love that. You just take your intrusive thoughts and you just whoop, now
Yes, no, that's
they're at work for you.
yeah, I am. Every time I have intrusive thoughts, I think, okay, how can I turn that into a story and then twist it?
That's
So
brilliant. I love it. And that means one, you've got a pretty good therapist that you can actually take your trauma and turn it into something. That's actually really great. I will say that not all of us can take our trauma and do that, but
not new trauma, only old trauma.
right, exactly. But to be able to process, and that has been that writing has been therapeutic for me as well. Like I've always loved writing, and I mean I kept diaries and journals and notebooks full of writing all the time when I was younger. But when I first started like focusing on pouring my thoughts and my dreams and that kind of thing into a book, I'm with you. Like the last year and a half, because I have generalized anxiety and a little ADHD to go with it. And so like my intrusive thoughts were always there, but oh my goodness, I have such an easier time processing those things when
Mm-hmm.
I sit down to write. And I don't know if that's because I've got my brain focused so that it's not constantly running off with itself. I don't know how that exactly works, but I'm not sad about it because it's something that with my counseling clients, like I will tell them like keep a journal because writing is therapeutic in a lot of
Mm-hmm.
ways, but turning it into fiction for me has been more therapeutic than just writing my own thoughts down.
Yep. And you don't, and the great thing is some of the I don't care to write some of the stories of my trauma. They're not interesting, but
Mhm.
even just taking a single paragraph and just putting it in your notes, because that's the other trick. This is what literally my therapist taught me this. Take that, I guess we learned it together. Write down the intrusive thought as a fictional character, write it for one paragraph, stick it in your notepad, and pat it on the head and say, I'll come back to you later. And so to me, that's great. You put it in there. But because like a few funny stories. So I was in Turkey in 2020. I had to go there during COVID. And they made me go, everyone had to do it 2 weeks in isolation. And that was when I learned that solitary confinement is a war crime. And that's when I had my first panic attack of my life in Turkey. And so I never ever intend to be anywhere in solitary ever again. That was terrible. And so even I'm an introvert, I'm a loud introvert, and I couldn't stand it. It was horrible because I only had maybe a half hour at either end of the day when my family was awake, when I wasn't supposed to be awake. And so terrible.
Mm.
But I've learned from that huge amounts for the writing. But at the end of it all, dealing with that trauma, I've learned, okay, now I have empathy and I understand people better, and I understand just the human desire for connection better.
Mhm.
I never understood that. And so, yeah, writing has gotten me through some of that trauma, but I definitely don't want that for anyone else.
Right.
But this comes back to the hardest thing in writing for me. How do you make your characters suffer?
Mm.
Because I hate making the protagonist make poor choices. I've doing it on a first draft is so hard. I have to consciously say, you have this fatal flaw. Now, no matter how much it hurts, you're going to make this mistake. Because I have 7 children.
Mhm.
I don't want them to suffer, but I watch as some of them make dumb choices and then they suffer from them. And some of them don't make dumb choices, but still suffer in other ways.
Mhm.
And so it hurts to see children suffer. And my characters are kind of my children,
Mhm.
but
Mhm.
you need to. It, so
Yeah, you have to. In my first book, one of the main characters, he gets in over his head in an investigation, and it costs him his life. And when I wrote that scene, I wept. Like when it happened, the military guys show up at the wife's door, and she just crumples, and like I sat there and bawled, and I'm like, I wrote this 2 minutes ago, and I was just crying. And Rob walks in, and he was like, "Are you okay?" And I'm like, Brian just died. And he's like, who's Brian? He was like, who's Brian? And I was like, anyway, so it was terrible. But at the same time, I knew that it's what had to happen in the story to move it along. Yeah. Do you hate to see it? Absolutely. Like I cried every time I read the draft of it. I cried until finally I don't want to say I was numb to it. But then I started getting angry messages from readers who were like, I cannot believe you killed him. And I was like, well, guess what? Brian had to die. Like it is what it is. Like that's how the story had to go, because I knew in the end there was going to be redemption. Like, and that's what I have to remind myself is that in the end there is redemption, regardless of what happens to the character in some form or fashion. Because that's how I have to write it. Like there has to be a happily ever after in some form or fashion, and so otherwise it's not going to happen. But I get that. Like you don't want to see them suffer because they are a part of your soul that you are putting on that paper.
Well, and that's one of the reasons I don't like the resurrection trope. Is that you lose some of that. So two Disney shows that I actually got angry at the end: Soul and Encanto. I think in both cases they ended wrong. In Encanto, the house should never have come back. That when she put that handle in, it should not have given them the magic again. That would have been the appropriate ending. It completely destroyed any emotional impact by giving them the magic back. And in Soul, I think that's what it's called, with the jazz guy.
Yes.
At the end, they just gave him back his life. No, he should have faded in and gone away. That's the appropriate emotional impact.
Yep.
He gave up his life for her, and that's it.
Yeah.
move on.
I agree. I agree. Yes, 1,000%. Like, and then Inside Out, when Bing Bong like fades into the imaginary friend, fades into the,
Ending for him.
yes, that was perfect. I cried. Like that was how it was supposed to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess for me, that's part of the whole process of writing is partly therapeutic for the writer, for the author. But we have to understand as authors, it's also therapeutic for our readers. There's one of the reasons we read is so that we can process our own trauma. What's the word? Through someone else.
Vicariously, yeah.
Thank you. And so it's the same thing as if you try to change a character's name, and your beta readers can get mad because they've emotionally attached. Like in one of my in that Regency one, I tried to change the name but my wife said, no, that's his name. You can't do that. Because she'd emotionally bonded to it. Okay, half joking question. Do you have a name that you default for every character? I always, my first instinct to name any male character is Frank. I don't know why. It's always Frank.
So my main character, female character, is Jess, and I tried really hard for some reason, and I totally set because it's a 2-book series so far. I'm hoping for 3, but then I started this other book, and I was like Jessica, and I'm like, just no, like
okay,
it's
you
not
can't
just
the same name. You can't, but
no, that's actually a valid question because I bet that happens a lot. And sometimes, you kind of have to put in a filler name anyway. You can go back and change it. But yes, no, Jess and Jessica apparently was my go-to. But I think it was because I had said it so many times that name was probably just in my head. I don't know, but yeah.
I've done it. I wanted to name one character Francois, one Francis. It was all just Frank derivatives.
I love it. Every time we have it, my kid has. She creates characters. I don't know that she's ever written a story for her characters, but her art is her thing. And so she draws and creates like physical characters all the time. And she's like, what should I name it? And I'm like, Steve. Like that's my default name is Steve because I don't know. I'm like, tell me about the character because to me, like the name has to match the character and I need to know some more. And she's like, no, and she like looks up, she's like, he's Russian. And so she's like looking up Russian names. I'm like, I would never have a Russian name on the tip of my tongue anyway. So Steve it is. Like, I can't help you.
If you ask me for a Russian name, I will immediately say Svetlana.
Oh, I like it. See, you would have a name in your back pocket. Like I would not. I'm like, Steve sounds great. I don't know. But yeah, naming characters, like that's personal. It's almost like naming a kid, like you said, like they're your children. Like you want the name to be exactly what it's supposed to be. Yeah.
No, I've discovered that characters are, I have to be careful not to just make them versions of me, but being a new enough writer, I can see when I do that. And it's easier when they're obviously different from you, but especially, I think we all fall into the trap of making the protagonist too much like ourselves, but an idealized version. And I think that's acceptable in a first draft, but then in a second draft, you go through and say, okay, let's get rid of the quirk where he says this catchphrase because that's my catchphrase. And it's challenging.
It is challenging. And it's funny because my 2 main characters, Jess is, she's basically a psychological profiler. And now this book came from, I went to bed, had a dream, woke up, the dream was unfinished. And so I wanted to finish the dream. I wanted to know what had happened. And so she's a psychological profiler. Yeah, I have psychology as my background, that kind of thing. But no, I didn't base her on me because I can't read people's micro expressions. Like, yeah, I have intuition, but I don't read people like she does. And then Brian he's a cybersecurity specialist for the US Army. Well, I'm so happened married to a cybersecurity guy, but that hasn't always been his job. He just so happened knows computers, but it needed to be part of the plot because he was investigating some nefarious action on the home front kind of thing. And it was just so happened. And so people asked all the time, they're like, well, is it based on you and Rob? And I'm like, no, I would never. Like, as a matter of fact, I try to distance myself completely from my characters for that reason, because there's still some boundaries. Like, we're not crossing these boundaries. You don't get to know me that well. I'm not putting, but you also write what you know, right? So sometimes it's easy to kind of see a little reflection, but not your whole self in your characters. I don't think.
Yeah, my main of the trio of engineers in my story, he is a lot of me, but if he had his anxiety fully under control and had lived a much more interesting life. And it's definitely a lot of me, but my other books I found I'm able to, with that out of the way, I'm able to write other characters a little better. But it's challenging in as much as I am putting part of my soul out there. Though funny thing at writers, I do a writers group with my daughter, and they were going over a chapter of the potential sequel, which is still very rough. And she had the critique. She said, "These people, he's sharing his feelings with his friends way more than he should." And I'm like, "What do you mean?" Well, he's being open with them. It's like, well, that's what healthy adults do. And she's like, they do? 17. And then the other adults in the room, the rest of the writers group, are like, yeah, that's right. Healthy adults can share their feelings with each other. Really? And that actually gave her hope, because she's just dealt with high schoolers who, if you share your feelings, they use it
Mm,
against you.
mhm.
And that was shocking for my 17-year-old. And she's very excited now for being an adult, because she's realizing healthy adults can talk to each other and
I
share
love
their
it.
feelings.
My
And what did
gosh.
she say? And she said, I just thought you were weird.
Thanks for humbling me, kid. That's what you're here for.
I've had that happen. I went to the Space Resources Roundtable. It's a big deal for space resources every year in Colorado. And I've taken children to it twice. And after the first time, my son, who was 15 at the time, he says, Dad, you're the most normal person here. And I was like, I don't know how to take that.
Hilarious. Oh my gosh. Well, I know that you have things going on in your world that and tomorrow is Monday, but before we go, what advice or encouragement would you send out there to anyone who's listening?
Well, besides reading my book in June,
Yes, definitely. Oh, and when you're done giving us your word of inspiration, tell us how to where your book is going to be, like when you think it's going to come out, and everything we need to your social media,
I
all
will.
that stuff, where we can find you.
So I think the biggest thing is you have a story to tell, no matter what people say, because especially that voice in your head, ignore it, because it's a
Mm,
liar. It tells you your story is not worth having, and it's an idiot, and it hates you. And why
mhm,
listen to something that hates you?
mm,
Because if I gave you a writing prompt, if I told you to write a story about a person with a poisonous kumquat and who was going into the American embassy in Tehran, you will write a different story than I will, and then anyone will. And your story will be just as worthwhile and probably better than mine. And so take a chance at it, because there's no point in keeping the stories to yourself. And the great thing with this whole self-publishing thing, take a gamble, put it out on a
mm,
subscription platform, put it out somewhere, just be willing. And I know it sounds like I'm someone who has no such thing as imposter syndrome, and I don't, but that's mainly because my background is in a field where that gets burnt out of you. Nobody who makes it as an engineer has any imposter syndrome left. But it also means I've seen people with imposter syndrome who do amazing things, because
mm.
I say, no, I believe. And so if you've got a story in you, it's there. Do it, take it, and share it, because I want to hear it.
That is exactly right, and that's the perfect word of encouragement to get out there. That's something that I say all the time on here. I'm like, just put it on the paper. Like, nobody else can tell the story like you can, because it's your story.
Mhm.
um, I can't tell your story just like you can't tell mine. Thank you so much for being here and hanging out. Like, I know that life is life, and between work and writing and family, like it's crazy. I know it is around here. And I'm just so thankful. And I can't wait to see what happens, like where you end up, because I think that you're going to go far. Like, I just have this feeling like there's a lot waiting for you out there. So
I
tell us where, like, oh, it's going to be amazing. All right, tell us about your book, like the name of your book, where you're going to put it out there, when you think it's going to be out there.
I wrote a log line, so it's called The Persian Asteroid, and the story is basically, by the Ayatollah's orders, an Iranian scientist kidnaps a trio of outer space engineers and is forced to reconcile himself to their optimism and snark as his actions decide the fate of his homeland. So it's written. I wrote it before the Iranian protests started, but when I first took it to my Iranian beta readers, they said, "Oh, this ending is unrealistic. We're never going to overthrow this regime." And then a few weeks later, they're like, maybe that wasn't so unrealistic. So they have hope in it, and I hope everyone buys it because I need to have that fund me getting it to Iran. I'm getting it translated into Persian as soon as I can, and I'm going to make it free in anywhere for in the Persian form so that it can give hope. And I'm hoping this does well for the Iranian people. But you go to my website, hyrumhawks.com. I'm the only Hyrum Hawks since 1860. It's actually not my real name, but for safety reasons, I am using a pen name because this is the kind of book that could lead to some amount of danger. But it is, yes, hyrumhawks.com, and join my newsletter, and I will have all of that on there. But I expect that as soon as I can go full time someday, I will be writing. My goal is 4 or 5 books a year, because I would not be able to slow down at that point. But yeah,
That's fantastic. Thank you. And where can we find you on social media?
if I'm not there, just look up Hyrum Hawks and I will be there. So Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, you name it, I'm Hyrum Hawks.
Fantastic. And it'll all be in the show notes. And so
Cool.
all you have to do is go check that out, and it'll be linked to all of his social media and to his website. And Hiram, if there's anything that I can do for you, like, don't hesitate to reach out. I mean, I don't know what I can do, but whatever you need, I will be glad to try to connect you with the right resource if I've got it in my back pocket.
Thank you very much. This has been fun.
Absolutely. It has been. And for those of you who are listening, like he said, it's okay to just sit down and start writing. Like, if you have a story to tell, and you probably do, and you have no idea where to start, just start, because writing is a journey. And like any great adventure, it requires a beginning, right? But you
just
can
like
veer it
Frodo.
off. Yes,
Frodo and Bilbo,
exactly.
I was 40 when I started writing. Bilbo didn't leave until he was like 50.
See, so, and don't be afraid to veer off course, right? Like,
Mhm.
just go explore those paths along the way and
Mhm.
embrace the unexpected, because you just never know where you'll end up.